Luxury service is not hospitality. It is the art of pleasing people with too much money and severe personality defects. They say living well is the best revenge. But they forgot to add that perfect revenge is using your enemy's money to orchestrate their downfall. I turned my cheating ex's wedding into a massive economic disaster. Grab a glass of wine. What I am about to tell you is far more satisfying than watching their credit card get declined. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us now. Let's begin the story. My name is Serenity Diaz. I am 32 years old, and I govern an empire built on ice, stone, and absolute discretion. Lumina Ridge Sanctuary is not merely a hotel. It is a fortress of solitude, an ultra-luxury eco-resort carved directly into the unforgiving, jagged cliffs of an isolated snowy mountain in Colorado. There are no neon signs leading the way up here. You will not find our nightly rates listed on any glossy travel website. We exist solely in whispers exchanged within exclusive corporate boardrooms. We accept guests exclusively through a strictly vetted, name-based invitation process. People come here when they have far too much money and a desperate need to feel untouched by the world below. I did not inherit this life. I crawled my way up here from the bottom of a very dark, very cold abyss. 4 years ago, I was foolish enough to believe in love. I was engaged to a man named Julian. We were supposed to build a technology empire together. I spent hundreds of agonizing, sleepless nights surviving on stale coffee and sheer willpower, writing the complex code for a revolutionary data mining algorithm. It was my masterpiece. But Julian had entirely different plans. Under the guise of finalizing our startup's incorporation, he slid a stack of mundane legal documents across our kitchen table. I loved him. I trusted him implicitly. I signed the papers without a second thought. With the casual stroke of a pen, he legally transferred the entirety of my intellectual property into his sole ownership. He stripped me of my life's work. Then, he tossed me aside like yesterday's trash, leaving me drowning in a massive ocean of corporate debt. He did it all so he could chase after Chloe, the spoiled, vicious daughter of a Silicon Valley billionaire. She was his golden ticket to the absolute elite. I was merely the stepping stone he crushed beneath his tailored Italian leather shoes to get there. Most people would have broken. They would have filed for bankruptcy and faded away into miserable obscurity. I took a different path. Armed with a meager life insurance payout left behind by a deceased relative, the absolute last pennies to my name, I bought an abandoned, rotting weather observatory. Perched high in the freezing Rocky Mountains, it was a desolate ruin, much like my own soul at the time. I hauled the timber myself. I hammered the nails until my hands bled. I poured every ounce of my rage into the foundation of what would eventually become Lumina Ridge. I designed a sanctuary so breathtaking, so painfully exclusive, that the very people who sneered at my downfall would one day beg to sleep under my roof. I became the invisible architect of their luxury. The air at Lumina Ridge is designed to be perfectly sterile, completely untainted by the chaos of ordinary life. That pristine silence was broken on a Tuesday morning. Elias, my director of events, a man who moves with the quiet precision of a ghost, stepped into my private office. The snow was falling heavily outside my floor-to-ceiling windows. He placed a heavy leather folder onto my obsidian desk. "We have a rather unusual inquiry, ma'am," Elias said, his voice completely neutral. It was an unprecedented request. A completely anonymous client wanted a full 3-day buyout of the entire resort property. They wanted every room, every staff member, and absolute privacy. The price tag they were offering without a single moment of negotiation was $200,000. The client listed on the initial paperwork was a generic corporate shell company named Nexus Ventures. At Lumina Ridge, anonymity is a privilege I grant, not a right you demand. I do not let anyone cross my threshold without knowing the color of their money and the skeletons hiding in their closet. I opened my personal terminal and fed the name Nexus Ventures into the advanced internal data scraping algorithm I had rebuilt entirely from scratch. My code never lies. It sliced through their encrypted corporate layers, bypassed their offshore proxy servers, and ruthlessly pulled up the ultimate beneficial owner. As the final name materialized on the glowing screen, the temperature in my office seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian. My thieving, treacherous ex-fiancé. He was the man hiding behind the empty shell corporation. My algorithm pulled his hidden financial records, laying his sins bare. He was blatantly skirting corporate law, funneling cash from a secret company slush fund to bankroll a monumentally lavish, snow-covered wedding for himself and Chloe. He was using his investors' capital to pay for his personal fairy tale, treating his company's treasury like a private piggy bank. Elias stood perfectly still, waiting for me to speak. A normal hospitality executive would have rejected the booking outright to avoid the messy personal drama. A lesser woman would have felt a sharp sting of lingering pain, but I felt nothing except the icy thrill of a predator spotting a wounded deer limping through the snow. I looked up at Elias and smiled a cold, hollow smile. "Approve the contract," I instructed him calmly. "Send it back to them tonight." But before the final digital signature was required from my end, I accessed the master file and quietly inserted a lethal trap into the deepest, most microscopic fine print of our terms and conditions. I called it Clause 89. It was an extremely sophisticated legal snare, meticulously outlining zero tolerance for the violation of staff dignity, moral turpitude, and the unauthorized misuse of corporate assets on our private property. If triggered, it gave me absolute, undeniable legal authority to terminate the event immediately, seize the massive deposit, and publicly document the infraction. I was not just going to host his beautiful winter wedding, I was preparing a meticulously orchestrated, totally inescapable economic slaughter. The violent, rhythmic chopping of rotor blades tore through the howling wind long before the aircraft pierced the thick curtain of gray clouds. The blizzard was arriving slightly ahead of schedule, swallowing the mountain peaks in a violent swirl of white. I stood in the shadows of the grand foyer, watching through the towering glass walls as the sleek, black private helicopter touched down on the heated helipad. The cabin door slid open, and there they were. Julian stepped out first, ducking beneath the spinning blades. He looked exactly as I remembered, albeit wrapped in a cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first car. Right behind him emerged Chloe. She was shivering dramatically, clutching a tiny, trembling designer dog to her chest. Her face twisted in a scowl of deep dissatisfaction as the mountain wind whipped her perfectly styled hair across her face. They had come for their mandatory site inspection, arriving like royalty demanding to survey their newly conquered territory. I was not standing there to greet them as the chief executive officer. I was completely invisible. I had dressed myself in heavy, insulated canvas coveralls, coated in a layer of fine ash. I wore thick steel-toed boots, and a heavy woolen beanie was pulled down low over my forehead, casting my face in deep shadow. A streak of black soot ran across my cheek. I was clutching a massive iron wrench, kneeling beside the colossal stone hearth that anchored the lobby, pretending to recalibrate the gas lines of the roaring fire. To people like Julian and Chloe, a person wearing a uniform and holding a tool was not a human being. We were merely part of the background scenery, functional objects completely unworthy of eye contact or consideration. They pushed through the heavy double doors, bringing a gust of freezing air into the meticulously climate-controlled sanctuary. The moment Chloe stepped onto the heated slate floors, the complaints began. Her voice was shrill, completely shattering the sacred tranquility of my resort. "Julian, look at this place," she whined, her sharp heels clicking aggressively against the stone. "It is entirely too rustic. Look at all this exposed wood. It feels like an overgrown hunting cabin. I told you we should have booked the Four Seasons. This aesthetic is remarkably cheap." She was waving her manicured hand dismissively at the hand-hewn cedar beams that had taken my construction team 6 months to perfectly cure and install. I kept my head bowed, my gloved hands gripping the iron wrench, turning a bolt that was already perfectly tight. "It is exclusive, Chloe," Julian replied, though he was barely looking at her. He had a sleek smartphone pressed tight against his ear, his eyes scanning the room with hollow distraction. "Exclusive is what matters. Hold on." He shifted his tone, his voice suddenly dripping with a sickeningly sweet, subservient enthusiasm. "Arthur?" "Yes, sir. The fourth quarter projections are incredibly robust. Absolutely. We are fully prepared to finalize the merger right after the wedding weekend. Your presence here will mean everything to the board." He was entirely consumed by his own ambition, desperately massaging the ego of a major corporate shareholder who held his financial future in the palm of his hand. He was completely ignoring the woman he was about to marry, leaving her to roam the lobby like a bored, destructive child. Chloe's eyes suddenly stopped darting around the room and locked onto the centerpiece of the grand foyer. It was a massive, ancient bristlecone pine tree, centuries old, which we had painstakingly preserved and built the entire glass atrium around. It was the living, breathing heart of Lumina Ridge. "Elias," Chloe snapped her fingers sharply at my director of events, who was standing a respectful distance away. "This tree is completely ruining the symmetry of the room. When the photographer sets up the evening lighting for the cocktail reception, this massive weed is going to cast a shadow straight across my profile. I need it chopped down and removed by tomorrow morning." Elias did not flinch. His expression remained a mask of flawless professional courtesy. "I apologize, madam, but that tree is a protected natural fixture of the property. It cannot be altered." "I am paying $200,000 to rent this pile of rocks," she hissed, taking a threatening step forward. "If I want that tree turned into firewood, you will fetch an axe." Before Elias could issue another polite refusal, a soft, metallic rattling sound echoed from the far corridor. Maya, one of my most dedicated housekeeping staff members, was pushing a heavy linen cart toward the service elevators. Maya was born completely deaf. She moved with quiet grace, her eyes focused intently on the heavy cart she was balancing. Chloe's designer dog suddenly leaped from her arms, barking frantically, and darted directly into the path of the rolling cart. Maya, unable to hear the sharp barks, did not stop in time. The heavy rubber wheel of the cart lightly bumped the dog's paw. The animal let out a sharp yelp and scrambled back to Chloe. It was a harmless accident, but to Chloe, it was an act of war. Maya immediately stopped the cart. Her eyes widened in panic. She stepped forward, bringing her hands up to sign a frantic, desperate apology, bowing her head in deep remorse. "Are you completely stupid?" Chloe shrieked, her face flushing crimson with sudden, explosive rage. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you. Do not wave your hands at me like a lunatic." Maya froze, her lower lip trembling, helpless in a world of sound she could not process. Without a single second of hesitation, Chloe reached out and snatched a heavy solid slate decorative tray from a nearby console table. With a vicious overhand swing, she hurled the solid block of stone directly at Maya. The heavy slate struck Maya violently in the shoulder. A dull, sickening thud echoed through the vast room. Maya stumbled backward, clutching her arm, tears instantly welling in her eyes from the sharp, sudden pain. I stopped breathing. The iron wrench in my hands felt burning hot. I looked toward Julian. He had witnessed the entire thing. He lowered his phone for exactly 1 second. He looked at Maya, clutching her bruised shoulder, and then looked at Chloe, who was currently soothing her perfectly uninjured dog. Julian did not say a word. He did not reprimand his fiancée. He did not ask if my employee was hurt. He simply turned his back, lifted the phone to his ear again, and walked toward the panoramic windows to continue his corporate groveling. In the dark corner beneath the stone hearth, I slowly let out a breath of freezing air. I did not step forward to intervene. I did not need to. I knew exactly where the high-definition security lenses were seamlessly embedded within the architectural stonework. The digital eyes of Lumina Ridge had captured every single frame of the assault, every pixel of her cruelty, and every ounce of his pathetic, complicit cowardice. As I watched them finally board the elevator to inspect their bridal suite, the remaining shards of mercy in my heart turned to solid ice. Canceling their contract would simply inconvenience them. Forfeiting their deposit would merely bruise their bank account. It was no longer enough. I was going to lock the doors, cut the power, and absolutely obliterate their entire existence. The subterranean wine cellar was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation, carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. The cavernous space was lined with vaulted brick arches and thousands of meticulously temperature-controlled bottles resting behind UV, filtered glass. Tonight, it served as the arena for the rehearsal dinner. The long banquet tables were crafted from single slabs of petrified wood, adorned with towering crystal candelabras that cast flickering shadows across the faces of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. These were not merely wedding guests. These were the apex predators of the tech industry. I recognized the venture capitalists, the board members, and the angel investors who held the absolute power of life and death over Julian's company. They were the very people he was defrauding to pay for this opulent feast. The air was thick with the scent of roasted duck, white truffles, and the intoxicating perfume of unimaginable wealth. I had shed my maintenance coveralls. Now, I wore the crisp, dark, tailored uniform of a junior sommelier. My hair was pulled back into a severe, unflattering bun. I wore a pair of thick, heavy-rimmed glasses that distorted my cheekbones and hid the sharp contours of my face. I carried a pristine white linen towel draped over my forearm. I had intentionally assigned myself to the central VIP table. I needed to control the stage. I needed to be close enough to feel their breath. The evening was progressing exactly as I anticipated. The investors were loud, boasting about market shares and hostile takeovers, while Julian sat at the head of the table, smiling a brittle, practiced smile, desperately playing the role of the visionary founder. Chloe sat beside him, dripping in diamonds, glaring at the waitstaff as if they were carrying infectious diseases. The catalyst arrived with the second course. I approached the head table holding a bottle of an exceptionally rare, vintage Bordeaux. It was a masterpiece of viticulture, valued at precisely $5,000 a bottle. I uncorked it with silent precision, decanted the dark crimson liquid, and poured a preliminary tasting measure into Chloe's crystal goblet. She lifted the glass, swirling the wine violently. She took a tiny sip. Instantly, her face contorted into a mask of pure disgust. She slammed the crystal goblet down onto the petrified wood table so hard I thought the stem would shatter. The heavy thud silenced the immediate conversation around her. "What is this?" Chloe demanded, her voice cutting through the ambient hum of the cellar like a rusted blade. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped behind my back. "That is the vintage Bordeaux you requested for the main course, madam." "It is swill," she shrieked, drawing the attention of the surrounding investors. "The temperature is entirely wrong. I explicitly demanded this be served at exactly 60 degrees. This is clearly 59 degrees. It is ruined. You have completely ruined the bouquet." It was a physical impossibility for a human palate to detect a 1-degree deviation, especially after she had just consumed half a plate of heavily salted caviar. It was not about the wine. It was about exercising absolute dominance. "I assure you, madam," I said, keeping my voice intentionally soft and deferential, "our climate-controlled cellars maintain absolute precision. The temperature is perfectly aligned with the sommelier's specifications." Chloe stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. The entire room fell completely silent. 150 pairs of eyes turned to watch the spectacle. "Do not talk back to me, you uneducated trash," Chloe screamed, her chest heaving with manufactured outrage. "You pour drinks for a living. Do not presume to tell me about wine. You are incompetent. Your entire staff is a collection of worthless, incompetent peasants." I took a half step forward, intending to offer a polite, rehearsed apology to de-escalate the manufactured crisis, but I never got the chance. With a vicious, lightning-fast motion, Chloe grabbed the crystal goblet and hurled the contents directly at my face. The shock of the cold liquid hit me like a physical blow. The $5,000 vintage Bordeaux splashed across my forehead, blinding my right eye, and began dripping heavily down my cheeks, soaking the crisp white collar of my uniform. The sticky, sweet-smelling red liquid dripped from my chin and fell onto the pristine stone floor. A collective gasp rippled through the cavernous room. Several investors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I did not wipe my face. I did not blink. I stood there, letting the expensive wine stain my clothes, staring at her through the crimson-spattered lenses of my thick glasses. Chloe reached into her designer clutch, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and threw it forcefully onto the wine-soaked stone floor at my feet. She let out a short, cruel laugh. "Kneel down and clean my shoes," she commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at my feet. "And wipe that floor. Do not let your disgusting, poverty-stricken appearance pollute my husband's sight. Earn your pathetic little tip." Slowly, deliberately, I turned my head to look at Julian. He was sitting perfectly still. Our eyes met. Through the thick glass of my fake spectacles and the dripping red wine, the disguise dissolved. For exactly 2 seconds, the hollow arrogance in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sudden, violent jolt of absolute terror. He recognized the shape of my jaw. He recognized the cold, dead stare he had created 4 years ago. He knew exactly who was standing in front of him. This was his moment. This was the singular moment where a decent man would have stood up, stopped the madness, and shown a shred of humanity. Instead, Julian looked away. He swallowed hard, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He looked at the powerful investors watching him, terrified of appearing weak. Then, he looked back at the table and offered a cowardly, pathetic smirk. "Do as she says," Julian muttered, waving his hand dismissively. "You are paid to serve. Just clean it up." The betrayal was absolute. The circle was complete. I did not kneel. I did not reach for the money. With agonizing slowness, I reached up and untied the knot of my sommelier apron. I let the dark fabric fall to the floor, covering the crumpled $100 bill. I reached down, picked up the saturated greenback with 2 fingers, and walked calmly toward Chloe. Before she could react, I dropped the wine-soaked bill directly into the crystal bowl of lemon water intended for washing her hands. I leaned in close, letting the scent of the spilled Bordeaux wash over her, and offered her a smile so devoid of warmth it could have frozen the blood in her veins. I turned my back on the absolute chaos, walking out of the subterranean cellar with perfectly measured steps. The gasps of the investors and Chloe's furious screaming faded behind the heavy oak doors as I left the room. The heavy oak doors sealed shut behind me, muting the outrage in the cellar to a dull, insignificant thud. I did not run. I walked with absolute purpose down the hidden, dimly lit concrete service corridor that served as the nervous system of Lumina Ridge. I pulled off the thick, wine-stained glasses and tossed them into a nearby disposal bin. I grabbed a clean linen towel from a supply cart and ruthlessly scrubbed the sticky Bordeaux from my face and neck as I approached the heavy steel door at the end of the hall. The biometric scanner flashed green as it read my fingerprint. The steel door hissed open, revealing the central control room. It was a massive, circular space bathed in the cool blue glow of dozens of high-definition monitors. This room controlled every digital, mechanical, and environmental aspect of the entire resort. Elias was already standing by the primary console, his hands resting lightly on the control panel. He looked up, taking in my stained uniform and wet hair, but his expression remained flawlessly professional. I tossed the ruined towel onto a chair. I looked up at the wall of monitors displaying the live feed of the dining hall. Julian was frantically trying to calm the murmuring investors while Chloe was screaming at an empty doorway. I gave Elias a single, sharp nod. "Initiate the purge protocol." Elias did not hesitate. His fingers flew across the illuminated keyboard. "Executing digital quarantine, ma'am." I reached forward and pressed the heavy silver button that activated the wide area signal jamming matrix. It was a sophisticated piece of military-grade hardware. legally permitted on the premises, strictly because the Nexus Ventures contract included a mandatory, signed agreement for absolute digital detox and corporate security. In the blink of an eye, the invisible net descended, the wireless routers died, the cellular repeaters shut down. In a fraction of a second, the smartphones of 150 tech billionaires transformed into useless, glowing rectangles of glass and metal. They were completely severed from the outside world. Communications severed, Elias reported. Beginning personnel extraction. Pull everyone out, I commanded, watching the screens intently. Get every waiter, every chef, and every security guard out of the main hall immediately. On the security feeds, my staff moved with practiced, military precision. They seamlessly backed away from the tables, disappearing through the concealed service doors before the guests even realized they were being abandoned. Lock down the service sectors, I ordered. Secure the kitchens and the staff quarters. And Elias, tell the culinary team to break open the premium reserves. They have permission to throw a lobster and champagne party in the main kitchen. No one goes hungry tonight except the people in that dining hall. Understood, Elias replied, a faint, rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. Engaging physical lockdown. I watched the primary schematic of the resort on the center monitor. I typed a sequence of commands, overriding the standard automated settings. The massive smart glass doors surrounding the banquet hall shifted instantly into weather lockdown mode. Heavy, soundproof locking mechanisms slammed into place with mechanical finality. I had just trapped the bride, the groom, and their 150 ultra-wealthy investors inside a perfectly sealed, inescapable glass box. They are contained, I murmured, my eyes fixed on Julian, who was suddenly tapping his phone in rising panic. Let us change the atmosphere. I bypassed the standard climate algorithms and directly accessed the smart heating grid for the subterranean cellar and the connecting grand hall. With a swift drag of my finger across the touchscreen, I completely disabled the radiant floor heating and shut down the massive thermal vents. The insulation algorithms were reversed, commanding the smart glass to actively draw the freezing ambient temperature of the raging blizzard outside directly into the room. The luxurious, comfortable warmth of the hall began to plummet, steadily dropping toward the bone-chilling, flesh-cutting cold of the high-altitude mountain storm. Final phase, I instructed, stepping up to the master visual control board. Usually, the massive 360-degree LED screens lining the upper walls of the banquet hall were programmed to display soft, ambient footage of the aurora borealis, accompanied by gentle, soothing classical music. I terminated the audio feed. The soft string quartet music cut off instantly, plunging the sealed room into a sudden, terrifying silence. I engaged the master broadcast system, routing my own camera feed directly to the massive screens. The digital trap was fully armed, the room was freezing, the doors were locked, the prey was completely isolated. The stage was perfectly set for the final judgment. The temperature inside the sealed banquet hall did not just drop, it plummeted with terrifying speed. Through the high-definition surveillance feeds in the control room, I watched the immediate, visceral reaction of the tech elite as the bitter, freezing breath of the Colorado blizzard invaded their exclusive sanctuary. The transition was chaotic. One moment, they were arrogant masters of the universe. The next, they were shivering, trapped animals. Men in tailored, thin silk suits began vigorously rubbing their arms, their breath forming small, white clouds of vapor in the rapidly chilling air. Women in backless, haute couture evening gowns huddled together, their diamond necklaces suddenly looking like icy shackles against their freezing skin. Panic, sharp and contagious, rippled through the crowd as 150 screens simultaneously displayed a complete loss of cellular and wireless signal. Chloe was the first to completely lose her composure. Her extravagant, impossibly thin silk dress offered absolutely zero protection against the dropping temperature. She stood near the center of the room, trembling violently, her teeth chattering so loudly I could almost hear it through the muted microphones. She began screaming hysterically at the empty air. demanding that the management present themselves immediately. She shrieked that she was freezing, that her perfect evening was being ruined, and that someone was going to be fired. Julian, meanwhile, had abandoned all pretense of corporate stoicism. His face was pale with a mixture of confusion and mounting dread. He rushed to the massive smart glass double doors that led back to the main resort corridors. He shoved against them with his shoulder, but the heavy weather-sealed locks held firm, frustration boiling over. He balled his fists and began violently pounding against the thick, reinforced tempered glass, shouting demands that echoed uselessly off the impenetrable barrier. The glass did not even vibrate. They were entirely, utterly trapped. It was time to introduce myself. I nodded to Elias. He flicked a switch, and the massive, 360-degree LED screens that completely encircled the upper half of the banquet hall suddenly flared to brilliant life. The frantic pounding and the high-pitched screaming instantly ceased. Every single head in the cavernous room snapped upward. Instead of the soothing, ambient northern lights they expected, my face towered above them, projected in massive, ultra-high-definition resolution across every single wall. I was no longer the subservient, wine-soaked junior sommelier with a hunched posture and thick glasses. I had changed into a sharp, immaculately tailored charcoal power suit. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, commanding style. I was sitting comfortably in my high-backed, black leather executive chair, one leg elegantly crossed over the other. In my right hand, I held a crystal goblet filled with the exact same $5,000 vintage Bordeaux that Chloe had thrown in my face just 20 minutes prior. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the silence in the room stretch until it became absolutely agonizing. I looked directly into the camera lens, projecting my gaze straight down onto Julian. I watched his jaw drop. I watched the blood completely drain from his face as the realization hit him like a physical blow. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing clearly and powerfully through the state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. "Welcome to Lumina Ridge Sanctuary. My name is Serenity Diaz. I am the sole owner and chief executive officer of this establishment. I hope you are enjoying the bracing mountain air." I paused, letting my eyes sweep over the crowd of terrified billionaires. "I am speaking to you now to issue a formal, legal notification regarding the booking made by Nexus Ventures," I continued, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "As of precisely 3 minutes ago, your 3-day, $200,000 buyout contract has been immediately and irrevocably terminated." A shockwave of murmurs tore through the freezing crowd. Julian took a step back, his eyes darting wildly around the room as if searching for a way to escape the digital execution. "The termination is due to a direct, egregious violation of Clause 89 of our binding agreement," I stated clearly. "Lumina Ridge maintains a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding the physical assault of our staff and the creation of a hostile, dangerous environment. Earlier today, the bride, Chloe, maliciously and intentionally attacked a deaf member of my housekeeping team with a heavy stone object." "That is a lie," Chloe shrieked from the floor, pointing a trembling, manicured finger up at the massive screens. "She is a liar. Turn this off immediately." I smiled, a sharp, cold expression. "I do not deal in lies. I deal in data." I pressed a button on my console. My image shrank to a smaller picture-in-picture box in the corner of the screens, and the main display instantly switched to the crystal-clear security footage from the grand foyer. The video played in brilliant, undeniable clarity. It showed Maya, my deaf housekeeper, accidentally bumping the small dog with her cart. It showed her frantic, apologetic sign language. And then, it showed Chloe, her face twisted in pure, ugly rage, grabbing the heavy slate tray and hurling it violently into Maya's shoulder. The gasp from the crowd was deafening, but I was not finished. "Notice the groom," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. I zoomed the camera feed in on Julian. The screen displayed his face in massive proportions. It showed him watching the violent assault, recognizing the cruelty, and then callously turning his back to continue his phone call, effectively endorsing the abuse. The reaction from the venture capitalists and board members was instantaneous and explosive. These were people who calculated risk for a living. They did not care about the moral failing of a ruined wedding. They cared about optics. They cared about public relations. They cared that their star chief executive officer was caught on high-definition video tolerating a brutal, unprovoked assault on a disabled worker. In the modern corporate landscape, a video like that going viral meant an instant, catastrophic plunge in stock value. They turned on Julian like a pack of starved wolves. "Are you completely out of your mind? Julian," screamed a prominent angel investor, shoving his way to the front of the shivering crowd. "Do you have any idea what this footage will do to the upcoming merger? You are a liability." "We entrusted you with $50 million in Series B funding," another board member roared, his face purple with rage. "If this leaks, we are totally ruined. You are finished. Julian, absolutely finished." Julian threw his hands up, stammering, trying desperately to placate the furious mob surrounding him. "Listen to me. We can handle this. We can pay her off. It is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," Chloe screamed, whirling around to face him. The cold had completely stripped away her elegant facade. Her makeup was beginning to run, and her teeth were chattering violently. "This is your fault. You told me this place was secure. You told me you had everything under control. You are entirely useless." "Shut your mouth, Chloe," Julian snapped back, his carefully constructed gentleman persona completely evaporating under the immense pressure. "You threw the stone. You are the one who could not control your pathetic temper for 5 minutes. You are destroying my company." "Your company?" Chloe laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound. "You only have a company because my father allowed it. You are nothing but a pathetic fraud in a nice suit." I sat back in my leather chair, taking another sip of the exquisite vintage Bordeaux. I watched the glorious, chaotic destruction unfold on the monitors. The high society illusion was completely shattered. The perfect, untouchable couple was tearing each other to absolute pieces in the freezing cold, surrounded by the very people who were now actively plotting their financial ruin. The purge was working perfectly, but the final nail was still waiting to be driven into the coffin. As the vicious, echoing argument between the bride and groom reached a deafening crescendo, the massive smart glass doors of the banquet hall suddenly hissed. The heavy weather-sealed locking mechanisms retracted with a loud, mechanical clank. The doors swung wide open. The bitter, freezing air of the trapped room collided with the perfectly climate-controlled warmth of the main corridor, creating a thick veil of swirling white mist at the threshold. Through that mist, I finally stepped onto the battlefield in person. I was no longer a projection on a screen. I was flanked by my personal, highly trained security detail, all wearing crisp black tactical uniforms. Walking directly beside me was a stern-faced man wearing a heavy trench coat and displaying a silver badge on his belt. He was a senior economic crimes investigator for the state of Colorado. The sudden, intimidating arrival silenced the chaotic bickering of the tech elite. The venture capitalists and board members parted like the Red Sea, creating a clear, unobstructed path straight to the center of the room where Julian stood shivering, his face pale and slick with a terrified sweat. I did not come here merely to evict them into the blizzard. I came here to perform a total execution of his professional life. I raised my hand, holding a thick, securely bound stack of printed financial documents. I did not hand them to Julian. I tossed the heavy binder directly onto the center table, right in front of the furious lead investors. "Since we are all gathered here to celebrate transparency," I announced, my voice slicing through the tense silence, "I thought the board of directors might be interested in the precise accounting of tonight's festivities. My internal data algorithms flagged a rather massive anomaly during the booking process." The lead investor aggressively snatched the binder and flipped it open. His eyes darted rapidly across the highlighted spreadsheets. "As you will clearly see," I continued, pacing slowly around the table, "Julian did not pay for this $200,000 wedding from his personal accounts. He successfully routed the entire payment through a series of offshore shell corporations, pulling directly from your company's restricted research and development slush fund. He completely falsified the expenditure reports, officially categorizing this opulent mountain getaway as a mandatory corporate strategic conference. A deathly quiet fell over the room. Embezzlement, corporate fraud. It was the ultimate, unforgivable sin in their world. The investor slammed the binder shut, his face twisted in absolute disgust, looking at Julian as if he were a rotting corpse. Julian's knees literally gave out. The sheer weight of the irrefutable evidence crushed whatever remained of his arrogance. He collapsed onto the cold stone floor, his expensive tailored suit bunching around his ankles. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, desperate terror. The man who had stolen my life's work, the man who had laughed at my humiliation, was now groveling at my feet. "Serenity, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whimper. "Please, I am begging you. Remember what we had. Remember our past. We built the foundation together. You cannot do this. Withdraw the documents. Tell them it is a mistake. I will give you anything you want." I looked down at him. I felt absolutely no pity. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the crumpled, wine-stained $100 bill that Chloe had thrown at me in the wine cellar. I stepped forward, looming over his trembling form. I threw the soiled greenback directly into his face. It fluttered for a brief second before landing on his knee. "You were absolutely right earlier tonight. Julian," I said, my words dripping with a venomous satisfaction. "I am paid to serve, and tonight I serve justice." I turned to the state investigator and gave a brief nod. The investigator stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He hauled Julian to his feet, forcefully twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp, metallic click of the cuffs locking around Julian's wrists was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. They marched him out of the room, still wearing his pathetic, wrinkled groom suit, destined for a concrete holding cell. Chloe, meanwhile, was frantically pulling credit cards from her designer clutch, attempting to order a private emergency helicopter extraction from her phone, which had just reconnected to the network. She screamed into the receiver, only to be met with the automated voice of her bank. In the wake of the catastrophic corporate fallout, her billionaire father had immediately cut all ties to avoid the media scandal. Every single one of her premium credit cards had been completely frozen. She was left entirely stranded, crying hysterically in the freezing snow outside the main lobby, waiting for a shared public shuttle bus that would not arrive until dawn. I ordered my security team to safely escort the remaining, untainted guests to their designated rooms or coordinate their immediate departure. The next morning, the sun rose over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains, painting the thick, fresh snow in brilliant shades of gold and pink. The leaked security video of the assault had already hit the major news networks. Julian's company stock had violently crashed by 70% before the market even fully opened. He was facing a potential sentence of 10 years in federal prison. Chloe had been entirely disowned by her elite social circles, reduced to a toxic pariah. I stood alone on the highest private balcony of Lumina Ridge. The bitter storm had passed, leaving behind a perfectly clear, crisp morning. I held a ceramic mug of steaming hot black coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. Below me, my dedicated staff was quietly and efficiently sweeping away the last remnants of the chaotic night, tossing shattered glass and abandoned decorations into the incinerator. Everything was finally, completely clean. My tablet chimed softly on the metal table beside me. The reservation system was updating. Word of my ruthless, uncompromising enforcement of guest conduct had spread like wildfire among the true, old-money elite. Those who genuinely valued absolute privacy and ultimate security realized that Lumina Ridge was an impenetrable fortress. Within just 6 hours of the dawn, my exclusive resort was entirely, completely booked solid for the next 2 years. I took a slow, deep sip of the rich coffee, staring out over the breathtaking, endless horizon. The air was pure. The empire was secure. The debt was finally paid in full. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Boss Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.